In January of the year 897, a corpse sat on a throne in Rome. It wore the full vestments of a pope. It had been dead for 9 months, and it was on trial. The judge was the living pope, Stephen VI. The defendant was his predecessor, Formosus, dug out of his tomb and propped up before a court of bishops. A teenage deacon crouched behind the dead man, appointed to answer questions on his behalf. This actually happened. The church itself would later call it the Synodus Horrenda, the horrible synod. And by the time the story was over, a pope would be strangled, a corpse would be pulled from a river, and Rome would tear itself apart. This is the strangest trial in history. Chapter 1. A City in Freefall. To understand how a dead man ended up in court, you have to understand what Rome had become. The great empire of Charlemagne was collapsing. His heirs had carved it into fragments, and no one was left to protect the papacy. Rome became a prize fought over by local warlords and noble families, and the papacy itself became a revolving door. Between 872 and 965, some 24 popes were appointed. In the years right after our story, from 896 to 904, there was on average a new pope every single year. Some were poisoned, some were imprisoned, some simply vanished from the record. Being elected pope in this era was less a coronation than a death sentence. This was the world that made the Cadaver Synod possible. Chapter 2. The Rise of Formosus. Formosus was, by most accounts, one of the more capable men of his age. He became Bishop of Porto, near Rome, in 864. Sent as a missionary to Bulgaria, he was so impressive that the Bulgarian king asked for him personally as archbishop. The pope refused. Church law forbade a bishop from moving from one seat to another. Remember that rule. It will come back with a vengeance. Formosus made powerful friends across Europe and powerful enemies at home. Pope John VIII accused him of conspiracy and excommunicated him. For years, Formosus lived in exile, but when John died, Formosus came home, reclaimed his old bishopric, and then in October of 891 he was elected pope himself. The man who was once cast out now wore the crown of St. Peter. But that old rule about bishops changing seats was still on the books. His enemies never forgot it. Chapter 3. A Deadly Game of Thrones. As pope, Formosus faced an impossible choice. Italy was dominated by the Dukes of Spoleto, a family with a tight grip on Rome. Under pressure, Formosus crowned the young Duke Lambert as co-emperor, but he did not trust the Spoletans, so he secretly invited a rival, the Frankish king Arnulf, to invade Italy and take the crown instead. Arnulf marched on Rome, and in 896, Formosus crowned him Holy Roman Emperor. It was a colossal gamble, and it failed almost immediately. Arnulf fell gravely ill and retreated back across the Alps. Within months, both he and Formosus were dead. The next pope, Boniface VI, lasted barely 2 weeks, and then came Stephen VI, elected just as the vengeful Spoletan faction marched back into Rome. The dead Formosus had left behind a city full of his enemies, and they wanted more than his legacy. They wanted his body. Chapter 4. The Trial of the Dead. Around January 897, Stephen ordered the tomb opened. What happened next was recorded by medieval chroniclers with a mixture of horror and disbelief. The 9-month-old corpse was dressed again in full papal vestments and propped upright on a throne in the Basilica of St. John Lateran. The charges, perjury, ambition, and taking the papacy while bishop of another seat. That old rule at last had its vengeance. Chroniclers say Stephen screamed at the body, "Why did you usurp the throne of Rome?" The deacon behind the corpse, speaking for a man he could not save, offered little defense. The verdict surprised no one, guilty on all counts. The punishment was theatrical. The corpse was stripped of its vestments and dressed in rags. The 3 fingers of its right hand, the fingers of papal blessing, were hacked off. Every act, every ordination Formosus had performed was declared void. The body was dumped in a common grave, then dug up once more, weighted, and thrown into the Tiber River. Stephen had erased his enemy, or so he thought. Chapter 5. The river gives him back. Rome was a violent city, hardened to spectacle. But this was too much. The trial disgusted the public, and then the story took a turn that felt like judgment from heaven. Formosus's body did not stay in the river. It washed up on the banks of the Tiber, and word spread that the drowned pope's corpse was performing miracles. Whether anyone truly believed it almost did not matter. Rome now had a martyr, and Stephen had made him. Within months, the city rose up. Stephen VI was deposed, stripped of his own vestments, and thrown into a cell. In the summer of 897, he was strangled in prison. The judge had outlived his defendant by barely half a year. That December, a new pope, Theodore II, annulled the entire trial and had Formosus reburied with full honors in St. Peter's Basilica. The next pope, John IX, went further. He burned the trial records and banned the trial of any corpse forever. Though even that was not quite the end. A few years later, Pope Sergius III, an old ally of Stephen, reportedly reaffirmed the conviction. Rome's civil war over a dead man's memory smoldered for a generation. So why put a corpse on trial? Because in 9th century Rome, the dead were never really gone. Every priest Formosus had ordained, every ruler he had crowned, carried his legitimacy forward. To destroy his enemies, Stephen had to destroy the source. It was never really a trial of a body. It was a trial of memory itself. And it teaches a lesson that echoes far beyond the Middle Ages. When power tries to erase a rival, it often creates something far more dangerous, a martyr. Stephen VI wanted Formosus forgotten. Instead, more than 11 centuries later, the only thing most people remember about Stephen is what he did to a dead man. If you enjoyed this, subscribe. There's a new deep dive every week.